There is a ritual that Nigerians perform every 4 years. They queue in the heat, they ink their thumbs, they wait for results, they argue on social media, they hold their breath when the returning officer steps to the microphone. And somewhere in Abuja, in a hotel suite, in a government residence, in a room with no cameras and no journalists, the men who actually decided the outcome are already ordering dinner. While everyone is talking about who won the election, nobody is asking the more unsettling question: at what point in the process was winning actually decided? And was it ever the point at which you cast your vote? This video is not about whether Nigerian elections are rigged in the crude ballot-stuffing sense that dominated the pre-2015 era. The mechanics have evolved. The infrastructure has changed. What has not changed is the fundamental architecture of how Nigerian presidential outcomes are determined. And most of that architecture operates long before election day, far above the level of the polling unit, and entirely outside the reach of the Independent National Electoral Commission. What really happened in Abuja is a story about power, money, institutional capture, and a democratic system that has learned to look functional from the outside while being managed from within. Most channels give you the headline. We give you the architecture behind it. If you have never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe now, because what comes next is the part they hope you never piece together. The architecture of the predetermined outcome. Understanding what really happens in Abuja before a Nigerian presidential election requires understanding that Nigerian democracy operates on two simultaneous tracks. The first track is the visible one: campaigns, rallies, debates, INEC announcements, party primaries, and the electoral process that citizens participate in. The second track is the one that matters: the negotiation of outcomes between a small number of extremely powerful actors who treat elections not as unpredictable contests, but as ratification exercises for decisions already reached. These two tracks are not entirely disconnected. The visible track creates constraints. A candidate who is spectacularly unpopular or whose party has visibly collapsed becomes harder and more expensive to install through the second track. But within those constraints, the space for genuine democratic surprise is narrower than most Nigerians who stand in those queues are ever told. The four pre-election instruments of outcome management. First, the party primary. In a country where the ruling party has historically commanded the majority of state resources and federal patronage, controlling who emerges from the party primary is functionally equivalent to controlling who wins the general election in most states. Party primaries in Nigeria are not voter contests. They are delegate markets, and delegates are purchased. The price of a presidential primary ticket, in documented, forensically traceable value, runs into billions of naira. That money does not come from the candidate. It comes from sponsors. And sponsors do not spend that money without a contractual understanding of what they are purchasing. Second, the godfathers. Nigeria's godfather system, the network of former governors, business oligarchs, retired generals, and regional power brokers who command the loyalty of state-level party machinery, does not merely influence elections. In many states, it determines them. A presidential candidate who has secured the support of the dominant godfather in enough states to cross the constitutional threshold of 25% in 2/3 of Nigeria's states has, in practical terms, already won the election, because those godfathers control the party structures, the security appointments, and the returning officers at the state level. Third, INEC. The Independent National Electoral Commission is constitutionally independent. In operational practice, its independence is bounded by the manner of its appointment, commissioners nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, and by the resource dependencies that shape its institutional behavior. This does not mean INEC is uniformly compromised. It means that the conditions for INEC's independence are partially controlled by the same executive it is supposed to provide oversight of. That structural tension does not disappear because individual INEC officials act with personal integrity. Fourth, the judiciary. Electoral tribunals and the Supreme Court are the final arbiters of disputed elections in Nigeria. They have, on documented occasions, produced landmark rulings that overturned incumbent outcomes. They have, on equally documented occasions, dismissed credible evidence of electoral fraud on procedural grounds that stretched credulity. The pattern is not of uniform corruption, it is of selective application, a judicial environment in which outcomes are unpredictable enough to require litigation, but predictable enough to be managed by actors with the resources and relationships to do so. Who specifically are the Abuja actors who negotiated the 2023 presidential outcome, and what did each of them receive in return? Is there any structural reform that could genuinely disrupt this architecture, or has the system evolved to absorb every reform so far attempted? Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. The 2023 election, a case study in outcome architecture. The 2023 presidential election is the most instructive recent case study because it is the election in which the visible track and the second track most visibly diverged. Bola Tinubu's emergence as APC presidential candidate, his negotiation of the Muslim-Muslim ticket against significant internal party resistance, his management of the Buhari succession dynamic, and his ultimate victory, certified by INEC and upheld by the Supreme Court despite documented irregularities, can be understood as a masterclass in second-track electoral management. The Abuja back-channel negotiations that preceded Tinubu's candidacy began not in the campaign season but years earlier, as far back as 2020 and 2021, when the architecture of the Buhari succession was being assembled by a small number of actors with simultaneous access to the presidency, the APC party machinery, and the financial networks that fund Nigerian political operations at scale. The public campaign, the rallies, the renewed hope messaging, the televised debates was the performance. The outcome was the product of a different process entirely. How money moves in Nigerian electoral politics. The financial architecture of a Nigerian presidential election is not at its core about campaign advertising or voter mobilization. It is about the systematic purchase of delegate loyalty at the party primary level, the compensation of state-level party officials for delivering official results that match agreed outcomes, the funding of legal teams to manage post-election challenges, and the payment of media operators to shape the information environment during and after the election. The sources of this financing are not primarily the candidates themselves. Presidential candidates in Nigeria are, in most cases, vehicles for the financial interests of the networks that assemble behind them. Those networks include domestic business oligarchs with regulatory interests that require executive protection, international finance interests with exposure to Nigerian sovereign debt and currency policy, and, in every election cycle, actors from within the state security architecture whose institutional interests are served by a particular outcome. The BVAS illusion. The introduction of the bimodal voter accreditation system in 2023 was genuinely significant in reducing the crude ballot stuffing and result sheet falsification that characterized earlier electoral cycles. INEC's technology reforms were real, and they produced real constraints on certain categories of fraud. Here is what the technology cannot do. It cannot prevent the purchase of a party primary delegate. It cannot reverse the outcome of a negotiation between a president and a regional godfather that took place 18 months before election day. It cannot undo the contractual relationships between a candidate and the financial sponsors who have already invested in the outcome. BVAS addressed the retail end of Nigerian electoral fraud. The wholesale end, The end where Nigerian elections are actually decided operates in rooms where no technology has jurisdiction. The role of the presidency in managing its own succession. One of the most structurally significant and least discussed features of Nigerian presidential politics is the role of the incumbent presidency in managing its own succession. A sitting Nigerian president controls federal appointments, security service deployments, the release or withholding of federal allocations to states, and the informal patronage networks that flow from the executive to the 36 governors. A sitting president who wishes to influence the direction of succession, either toward a preferred candidate or away from a threatening one, possesses instruments of influence that no campaign strategy can match. The Buhari to Tinubu transition, understood in this framework, was not simply a party primary and a general election. It was a managed succession, in which the incumbent presidency's posture, deliberately ambiguous in public, more precisely calibrated in private, shaped the field of viable candidates, the loyalty of state party structures, and the operational environment in which INEC conducted the election. The outcome was not predetermined in the sense of being mechanically fixed. It was predetermined in the sense that the structural advantages assembled for one outcome were so overwhelming that any alternative required an insurgent coalition of comparable scale, and none existed. What this means for Nigerian democracy. A democracy in which electoral outcomes are substantially determined by pre-election negotiations between a small number of powerful actors is not, in any meaningful sense, a democracy of the people who vote in it. It is an oligarchic system with democratic aesthetics. The queue, the ink, the thumb, these are not meaningless. They create a legitimacy performance without which the system cannot function. But their function is legitimation, not determination. The determination happened earlier, elsewhere, and by different people. The national implication of this is not simply that elections are unfair, though they are. The deeper implication is what it does to the relationship between citizens and the state over time. When enough Nigerians, particularly young Nigerians who mobilized with genuine hope in 2023, come to understand that the system processes their participation without being genuinely determined by it, the institutional damage is profound. The 2023 election produced the lowest voter turnout in Nigeria's Fourth Republic. That is not a coincidence. It is data. The governance consequence of transactional succession. When a president arrives in office as the product of a transactional succession, owing his position to a network of financiers, godfathers, and power brokers who funded and facilitated his emergence, the governance consequences are structural. He cannot pursue policies that threaten the regulatory interests of his financial backers. He cannot reform the procurement systems that sustain his political network. He cannot appoint technocrats to positions that his godfather network requires for patronage distribution. His agenda is bounded by the terms of the contracts through which he acquired power, whether or not those terms were ever written down. This is why Nigerian presidential administrations consistently disappoint their stated policy ambitions. It is not primarily a question of competence or intention. It is a question of structural constraint. A president who owes his position to a network is accountable to that network before he is accountable to the electorate. And that network's interests are not, in general, the interests of 220 million Nigerians. The strongest counter-argument. The most serious challenge to this analysis comes from those who point to genuine electoral uncertainty in Nigerian politics. Goodluck Jonathan lost the 2015 election. Incumbent governors have been defeated across multiple states. Peter Obi's 2023 performance demonstrated that a candidate without conventional godfather backing could win Lagos, arguably the most significant single electoral unit in Nigeria. Courts have occasionally overturned incumbent wins. If the system were as closed as this analysis suggests, none of these outcomes would be possible. This is a real and important counter-argument, and it demands a direct answer. Why exceptions prove the rule? The exceptions do not disprove the architecture. They define its limits. The system is not perfectly closed. It is a system that manages outcomes within a range, and occasionally that range is wide enough to accommodate genuine surprise. Jonathan's 2015 loss happened because the structural advantages assembled against him, international pressure, a united opposition coalition, a military that declined to intervene, and an incumbent too depleted to activate the full apparatus, that was a failure of the system's management capacity, not evidence that the system does not exist. Every election that confirms a pre-negotiated outcome affirms the architecture. Every exception defines where the architecture's load-bearing capacity was exceeded. Neither cancels the other. Can this architecture be broken? The honest analytical answer is yes, but not through the mechanisms most reform advocates are currently pursuing. Electoral law reform, INEC technology upgrades, and civic education campaigns all operate on the visible track. They are not without value. BVAS genuinely reduced certain categories of fraud, and strong civic participation creates the legitimacy pressure that makes managing outcomes more expensive. But they do not reach the second track, which is where Nigerian elections are decided. Breaking the second track architecture requires three things that Nigerian civil society and opposition politics have not yet achieved simultaneously: a credible opposition candidate with access to comparable financial resources and institutional networks, a fractured incumbent coalition in which Godfather loyalty has been disrupted by internal conflict rather than managed from the center, and an international environment sufficiently attentive to Nigerian democratic integrity to create external accountability pressure on the judicial and electoral processes. None of these conditions is present in isolation. The 2027 question is whether they can converge and whether they can do so before the incumbent coalition completes its succession management. Signals to watch before 2027. Watch the APC internal dynamics through 2025 and 2026. Fractures within the ruling party, particularly between the Tinubu network and the residual Buhari network, are the most reliable early indicator of whether the incumbent coalition is managing its succession or fighting over it. A fighting coalition is a manageable coalition for the opposition. A unified one is not. Watch the Godfather alignments in the Southwest, Northwest, and North Central, the three geopolitical zones whose swing capacity is greatest in a presidential election. Any documented shift in the Godfather calculus in those zones, through defection, through financial incentive, through generational replacement of old power brokers, changes the structural map of 2027. Watch the judiciary. The appointments to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal in 2025 and 2026 will shape the institution that will adjudicate whatever dispute emerges from the 2027 election. Judicial appointments in Nigeria are not politically neutral, they are strategic. The specific Abuja actors in 2023, the documented financial and political network behind the Tinubu candidacy, includes Lagos-based business interests with regulatory exposure to federal policy, Northwest political figures whose support was secured through negotiated federal appointments, and South-South power brokers whose neutralization was as important as their active support. The precise contractual terms of those arrangements remain partially in the territory of informed inference rather than fully documented fact. Afro News HQ will continue to track and report as documentation becomes available. Whether reform can disrupt the architecture. The only reform that has historically disrupted entrenched electoral management systems in Nigeria and in comparable political economies globally is a combination of sustained mass civic mobilization, opposition coalition building that matches the incumbent in financial and institutional capacity, and an external accountability environment that raises the cost of visible manipulation. All three must be present simultaneously. Nigeria has never yet produced all three at the same moment. Whether 2027 is different remains the defining political question of this democratic cycle. We opened this video with the image of Nigerians queuing in the heat, thumbs inked, waiting for a result. That image is real. Those people are real. The courage it takes to participate in a democratic process that has repeatedly failed to honor their participation is real. What is also real is the room in Abuja where the outcome they are queuing to produce has already been discussed, negotiated, and substantially agreed. The distance between those two realities, between the queue and the room, is the precise measurement of Nigeria's democratic deficit. Closing that distance is not a technical problem, it is a political one. It requires Nigerians who understand the architecture of the system they are trying to change, not just its visible surface but its structural foundations, to organize with the same sophistication, the same resources, and the same strategic patience that the architects of the current system have used to build and maintain it. You now understand the architecture. What you do with that understanding is the most important political question you will answer before 2027. The ballot is not powerless, but it is not the only instrument of power, and those who control the others know it far better than those who only hold the ballot. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight do not know. What you do with that is up to you. Share it, debate it, challenge it. That is how democracies survive. Afro News HQ. Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next.